It was the kind of town where the loudest sound on a summer evening was the creak of a porch swing and the hum of cicadas in the trees. Everybody knew everybody, or at least thought they did. The church bells rang on Sundays. Kids played baseball in dusty fields, and the sheriff's truck was as much a part of Main Street as the diner sign that buzzed neon at night. People here believed in order, in family, in tradition, and they believed in him. For 2 decades, Sheriff Harold Whitmore wasn't just a man in uniform. He was the pillar that held the town upright. His handshake was firm, his presence reassuring. If you asked around, they'd tell you his marriage was proof that small-town love could survive the storms of life. 20 years, no scandals, no whispers, just a devoted husband and wife living in a white-framed house at the edge of town, the porch light always glowing like a beacon of stability. Neighbors remembered summer barbecues at their place, the sheriff flipping burgers while his wife set out sweet tea in mason jars. At Christmas, the wreath on their front door was the first to go up, the last to come down. At town hall meetings, she sat quietly in the front row, nodding along as her husband spoke about safety, duty, and protecting their way of life. Folks admired them because in a world that felt increasingly uncertain, their marriage looked steady, almost untouchable. People called them the perfect couple. It was the kind of phrase that rolled off tongues easily, the kind that made others lower their voices in envy. But perfection is fragile, and in small towns, it's also theater. Behind closed doors, the curtains drawn tight, who really knows what goes on? Still, no one in their wildest imagination could have guessed the secret that lay inside that house. If someone had whispered the truth back then, they'd have been laughed out of the diner. It was unthinkable. And yet, the truth had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to explode. On Friday nights after football games, teenagers sometimes drove past the Whitmore home, headlights sweeping across the porch where the sheriff and his wife rocked in silence. To young eyes, it looked like something out of a storybook. Stability, respect, safety. Parents pointed to them as an example. That's what a good marriage looks like. That's what loyalty means. No one knew those words would soon curdle into bitter irony, because even legends carry shadows. The sheriff's badge, polished and pinned to his chest, wasn't just a symbol of law. It was armor. Armor against suspicion, against gossip, against the kind of questions that might have rattled lesser men. And for 20 years, that armor worked. People trusted him so deeply that even when cracks began to show, small arguments overheard through open windows, a tense silence at a Sunday potluck, folks brushed it aside. Every marriage has rough patches, they said. The sheriff and his wife will be just fine. And so the town carried on, blind and blissfully unaware, while the Whitmore house became a stage for the most devastating act of deception anyone there had ever witnessed. A secret buried so deeply it seemed almost mythic. A truth so explosive it would turn the sheriff from the town's protector into its greatest criminal. Years later, people would recall that summer with a kind of haunted disbelief. They'd sit on their porches, iced tea sweating in their hands, and shake their heads. We thought we knew them. God help us, we thought we knew. The story that would shatter the town's illusion of peace didn't begin with the crime itself. It began here, in the hush of a place where reputation was everything, where appearances were sacred, and where no one could have predicted that the most respected man in town was living with a secret that would lead to murder. Because in that quiet town, under those ringing church bells, the perfect marriage everyone envied was already a ticking bomb. And the man who wore the badge, the man people swore they trusted with their lives, was the one holding the match. They met in the kind of way that small-town folks love to tell and retell, the story polished smooth over years like a stone in a river. It was at a county fair, long before Harold Whitmore ever wore the star of sheriff. He was a deputy back then, lean and ambitious, still building his reputation. She was a new face in town, graceful, reserved, someone no one knew much about. People remembered the way Harold looked at her that first night under the carnival lights, like he just found what he didn't even know he was searching for. Within a year, they were married in the little white church on Main Street. The bells rang, the congregation stood, and from that moment forward, They were inseparable in the eyes of everyone who watched. Their marriage became the town's anchor. Every holiday, every parade, every fundraiser, they were there together. If Harold was in uniform at the Veterans Day ceremony, his wife was right beside him, hand over heart, eyes shining with pride. At the county fair, she worked the pie table while he walked the grounds, keeping an eye on teenagers sneaking sips of beer behind the bleachers. They were the couple everyone expected to see at Sunday service, their heads bowed in unison, their hymnals held open to the same page. It wasn't just a marriage. It was a symbol of what people believed love and loyalty should look like. Behind the curtain of small-town chatter, though, there were little mysteries people learned not to question. She never spoke much about her past, never brought family around. When asked, she'd smile politely and change the subject, and Harold, protective as ever, would rest his hand over hers and move the conversation elsewhere. Neighbors figured she'd had a hard life before coming here, maybe a childhood too painful to revisit. Folks respected that. After all, everyone deserved a fresh start, and Harold seemed so fiercely devoted, no one dared pry. He built his career on that devotion too. As sheriff, Harold often said his family was what kept him grounded. He told reporters once, "The badge doesn't mean anything if you don't have a good home to come back to." And people believed him because they saw the proof every time they drove past that white-framed house with the neatly trimmed lawn and her flowers blooming along the porch. They saw her in the yard on summer mornings, waving to neighbors, and him in the evenings, bringing in groceries. In a town that thrived on routine, their life was reassuring, almost cinematic. But even perfect pictures have cracks if you know where to look. Her modest clothes and her constant excuses at social events left neighbors curious but silent. And in a place where gossip could spread like wildfire, people let the mystery lie. After all, wasn't every couple entitled to their own boundaries? The truth was, Harold seemed to love her all the more fiercely for those guarded edges. He called her his rock, his better half. At anniversaries, friends would toast to 20 years of loyalty and laugh about how rare that was in a modern world. They just don't make marriages like that anymore, one of his deputies once said at a barbecue, and everyone agreed. It became a kind of mantra. The Whitmores were proof that true love existed. And yet, if you listened closely in the right moments, you might have caught the sharp edges beneath the gloss. A hushed argument in the kitchen, quickly silenced when a guest knocked on the door. A flicker of tension in Harold's jaw when someone at the diner asked her about her childhood. The way she sometimes pulled away when affection came too suddenly, then forced a smile to cover it. These were the kinds of moments people noticed and quickly dismissed, because it was easier to believe in perfection than to entertain the thought that something so carefully built might not be what it seemed. Still, the life they crafted endured. Birthdays came and went, wedding anniversaries stacked up like trophies, and their reputation as the town's perfect couple only grew stronger. For Harold, it was more than marriage, it was legacy. A man doesn't just keep the peace in his town. He protects the sanctity of his home. And for 20 years, Harold Whitmore made sure that no one, not a neighbor, not a deputy, not even the nosiest church lady, ever had reason to doubt the image he and his wife projected. By the time 2 decades had passed, their life together wasn't just a marriage anymore. It was folklore. The Whitmores were untouchable, their bond treated like gospel truth in a town where appearances were currency. No one questioned, no one suspected. And Harold, with his star pinned to his chest and his wife's quiet presence beside him, believed the story as much as anyone else. He believed he had built the kind of life that couldn't be shaken, the kind of marriage that could weather anything. Until the night the mask slipped, and the truth came rushing out like floodwater, drowning the legend he had worked so hard to protect. It started with something small, something ordinary. That's how these things always begin. An envelope left on the kitchen counter, a drawer pulled open just a little too far, a moment when routine slips and secrets spill into the light. For Sheriff Harold Whitmore, the discovery came late one humid summer night, when the air in the house felt thick enough to choke on. He had come home earlier than usual, his boots heavy with dust from the back roads, his mind buzzing with the dull weight of unfinished paperwork. His wife was upstairs, the sound of the shower running steady, when his eyes fell on the drawer of her desk, left cracked open. Harold wasn't the type to snoop. For 20 years, he'd lived by a code of trust. But that night, something pulled him toward it, maybe the faint gleam of folded paper half hidden, maybe just instinct. He slid the drawer open, and there it was, a faded folder with a hospital's name stamped across the front. His wife's maiden name typed neatly on the corner. He frowned, thumbing through pages, until the words caught him like a knife. Sex reassignment. Original gender. Male. The room tilted. He blinked once, twice, reading again, certain his eyes had betrayed him. The words were still there, black ink on yellowed paper. His hands trembled as he gripped the folder tighter, flipping page after page. Records of surgeries, hormone treatments, medical notes from doctors long retired. A whole life written in terms he couldn't process, and he was only now realizing there was a hidden chapter of her life he'd never been allowed to see. The shower upstairs cut off. Water dripped, pipes groaned. Harold stood frozen in the kitchen, folder clutched like a weapon. His heart pounded so loud he was sure she would hear it. The footsteps came down the stairs, light and familiar, and when she walked into the room, towel wrapped around her shoulders, she smiled the same way she always had. But to Harold, nothing looked the same. "What's wrong?" she asked softly, her eyes flicking to the folder in his hand. For a moment, neither spoke. The clock on the wall ticked in agonizing rhythm. Then Harold's voice cracked like thunder. "You lied to me. For 20 damn years, you lied." Her face drained of color. She stepped forward, hands trembling, whispering, "Please, let me explain." But there was no explanation that could pierce through the storm roaring in his chest. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered promise now felt like a performance, a joke played on him in front of the whole world. He saw flashes in his mind, neighbors nodding with respect, deputies raising their glasses, the congregation calling there's a model marriage. And now, he felt like the fool at the center of a cruel stage play. "You think I won't find out?" he snarled. "The town, the church, the men I serve beside? You think I can hold my head up when the truth comes out?" Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. "Every single day, I loved you. I was terrified that if you knew, I'd lose you, that the life we built would vanish. I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted to be your wife." Her words struck him, but instead of softening, they cut deeper. Love, loyalty, devotion, those had been the pillars of his life, his badge, his marriage. And now those same words felt like poison. Neighbors later swore they heard shouting that night, muffled but fierce, spilling into the quiet street. Some thought it was just another marital spat, the kind that blew over by morning. No one imagined the truth. A sheriff unraveling, a secret clawing its way into the open, the spark that would ignite the fire. Harold paced the kitchen like a caged animal, folder still in hand. "You made me a fool," he spat. "Do you know what this will do to me? To my name? To everything I've worked for?" "It's not about your name," she cried, stepping closer. "It's about us. About love. You know me. You know who I am." But Harold's mind was already spiraling into darkness. To him, the revelation wasn't just personal. It was public humiliation waiting to happen. He saw the whispers spreading through the town. The headlines splashed across newspapers. Sheriff's wife wasn't who she seemed. He saw his deputies' smirks, the pastor's disappointment, the voters' outrage. He saw his entire world collapsing under the weight of one truth he never asked to face. In that moment, the sheriff's love for his wife, the quiet, enduring bond of 20 years, was drowned out by something stronger: fear. Fear of ridicule. Fear of exposure. Fear that the man who had built his reputation on order and honor would be remembered as the sheriff who couldn't even see the truth in his own home. The argument stretched on into the night, voices rising, chairs knocked over, glass shattered on the floor. Somewhere between her pleas and his rage, the man the town trusted disappeared, replaced by a storm no one could contain. And then, as silence finally swallowed the house, only one truth remained. The secret had been uncovered, and with it, the marriage that had stood for 20 years was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. By morning, the sheriff's world would never look the same again, and neither would his town. The fight didn't stop with words. By the time the clock struck midnight, the Whitmore home was a pressure cooker, steam hissing, waiting to blow. Sheriff Harold Whitmore, the man who kept the town in line, was pacing the kitchen floor like a predator circling prey. His wife stood near the counter, trembling, clutching her towel tighter around her shoulders as though the thin cloth could shield her from the fury spilling out of him. The folder of medical records lay open on the table, its pages fluttering like wings in the ceiling fan's draft, damning proof that the life they had shared was built on a truth he couldn't face. "You made me a joke," Harold seethed, his voice low, guttural. 20 years, and you let me stand out there like some blind fool while you hid this from me. Every handshake, every speech, every sermon about honor and family, what was it worth? Nothing. Nothing. She tried to speak, but her voice was drowned by the crash of his fist against the table. The coffee mug tipped, shattering on the linoleum. He loomed over her, his face flushed, eyes burning with something darker than rage. It was terror wrapped in fury, the kind of fear men like him could never admit. "You don't understand," she pleaded. "It wasn't a lie. It was survival. If I'd told you, if I'd told anyone, I'd have lost everything. We both would have. You think this town would forgive me?" he shouted. "You think they'll still call me their sheriff when they find out? They'll spit in my face. They'll say I was duped, that I couldn't even see what was in my own bed. You've ruined me." Her tears fell freely now, her voice shaking but steady with resolve. "No, I loved you. I still do. That doesn't change because of what I was born. I am your wife, Harold. I have been every single day." But he wasn't listening. He couldn't. To him, every memory had been rewritten in an instant. Their wedding, their anniversaries, every tender night on that porch swing. What once looked like love now felt like mockery. His pride, his name, the respect of his deputies, the admiration of his town, all of it, in his mind, dangled on the edge of ruin because of her secret. He turned toward the cabinet, yanked it open. The glint of steel caught her eye before she saw what it was, his service revolver. Her breath hitched. She took a step back, palms out. "Harold," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, don't do this." But the sheriff's grip tightened on the weapon, his knuckles white. His hands shook, not from hesitation, but from the storm inside him. He raised the gun, his arm rigid. 20 years you let me love a lie," he growled. "I can't let this stand." Neighbors later said they heard a scream, sharp, desperate, cut short by the echo of a gunshot. Then another. Then silence. The town slept through the night while the sheriff's house became a crime scene, the kind of place deputies would mark off with yellow tape by morning. When it was over, Harold stood alone in the kitchen, his wife's body crumpled on the floor, her blood pooling dark and wide across the tiles. The towel had slipped away, her face turned toward him, eyes glassy, lips parted in a final plea. The folder still lay open on the table, her truth spread out in black and white, now stained with speckles of red. For a long moment, the sheriff just stared. His chest heaved, his hand trembling around the gun. The rage that had driven him was already cooling, leaving only an echo, a hollow pit in his stomach that yawned wider with every breath. He set the revolver on the counter, his fingers brushing against the steel like it burned him. He staggered to the sink, gripping the edge until his knuckles cracked. His reflection in the darkened window stared back, a man no longer in uniform, no longer the town's protector, just a killer, a husband who had traded 20 years of love for a single night of rage. Outside, the crickets chirped, the world carrying on oblivious. But inside that house, the silence was suffocating. He tried to wash the blood from his hands, the red spiraling down the drain, but it clung to his skin, seeping into his pores. No amount of scrubbing could erase what he'd done. In desperation, he began to clean. He wiped the floor, dragged a rug over the stains, stuffed the bloody towel into a trash bag. He moved with the precision of a man who had investigated countless crime scenes, who knew exactly what police would look for. He thought, absurdly, that he could cover it up, that the badge he wore would shield him one more time. But nothing could silence the evidence. The neighbors who'd heard the shots, the gun in his possession, registered in his name, the medical records that explained everything he wished had never been revealed. By dawn, the sheriff sat slumped in his armchair, staring blankly at the muted television flickering in the corner. His uniform still lay on a hanger in the closet, pressed and clean, ready for another day of duty that would never come. Upstairs, the bed they had shared for 20 years lay cold and empty. When a knock finally came, first tentative, then louder, urgent, he didn't move. A neighbor, worried after hearing the sounds in the night, had called it in. Soon the flashing lights of patrol cars bathed the street, deputies whispering in disbelief as they stepped into the home of the man they had followed for years. What they found stopped them cold. Their sheriff, hollow-eyed, his hands still faintly stained, sitting in silence while his wife's body lay lifeless on the kitchen floor. The image seared itself into the town's memory. The fall of a man they once called untouchable, undone by a secret and the violence it sparked. By morning, word spread like wildfire. Phones rang, whispers turned into shouts, the diner buzzed with rumors. The sheriff killed his wife. But that wasn't even the half of it. The truth behind the murder, the revelation that shattered not just a marriage but the town's very sense of what was possible, was still waiting to hit. And when it did, the perfect picture of Harold Whitmore's life would collapse completely, leaving behind nothing but blood, betrayal, and questions no one knew how to answer. The first call came just after sunrise, when the town was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes. A neighbor, shaken, told dispatch she'd heard shouting from the Whitmore house the night before, followed by what she swore were gunshots. Maybe it was nothing, she said nervously, but something in her gut told her it wasn't right. Within minutes, the quiet street was buzzing with patrol cars, their lights strobing against the neat white fences and flower beds. Deputies who had long looked up to Sheriff Harold Whitmore now found themselves pulling into his driveway, uncertainty heavy in the morning air. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house smelled faintly of bleach, sharp and artificial. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. This was a scene they knew too well from their training, but never in their lives had they expected to find it here. One deputy called out, his voice trembling, "Sheriff?" The silence that answered was unbearable. They moved cautiously through the rooms, flashlights cutting across walls lined with family photos, certificates of service, framed newspaper clippings of Whitmore shaking hand with governors and pastors. In the kitchen, the beam of a flashlight froze. A body lay crumpled on the floor, blood soaked deep into the linoleum. Beside it sat Harold himself, slumped in a chair, eyes hollow, his service revolver resting uselessly on the counter. The deputies stopped in their tracks. Some couldn't breathe. Others whispered curses under their breath. This wasn't a stranger, a suspect, or a name from a case file. This was their sheriff, the man who had sworn them in, who had guided their hands on their first arrests, who had built their careers. And now, here he was, sitting in the middle of a crime scene he'd created. One deputy finally broke the silence. "Sheriff, what did you do?" Harold didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the floor, unblinking, as if he hadn't heard. Within the hour, the county investigators arrived, summoned from a neighboring jurisdiction to ensure impartiality. Crime scene tapes stretched across the manicured lawn. Reporters began circling like vultures, and townspeople gathered in small, hushed clusters at the edge of the street. The legend of Sheriff Whitmore was already beginning to crumble before their eyes. Inside, the investigation unfolded methodically. Photographers documented the scene. The overturned chair, the shattered mug, the folder of medical records still stained with blood. The revolver, its chamber reeking of burned powder. The body of Mrs. Whitmore, lifeless, her features frozen in a final, pleading expression. The medical examiner confirmed the violence. But the paperwork spread across the table revealed the undeniable truth. She had been born male. That revelation sent ripples of shock through the investigators themselves. They glanced at each other, whispering under their breath. This wasn't just a homicide. It was a scandal of a magnitude no one had prepared for. A sheriff's wife murdered in cold blood, and the secret of her identity waiting to explode into the public eye. Detective Carla Hughes, assigned to lead the case, studied Harold with a mix of disbelief and grim determination. She had worked under him once, back when she was a rookie. He had been her mentor, her role model. Now she looked at him not as a superior, but as a suspect, one who sat slouched, his badge still pinned to his chest like a cruel reminder of what he once represented. "Sheriff Whitmore," she said firmly, her notepad open. "We need your statement." His eyes flicked to hers for the first time, red-rimmed, glassy. For a moment, Carla thought he might break down. Instead, he muttered in a hoarse voice, "She lied to me. For 20 years, she lied." Those words, barely audible, carried through the room like poison. A deputy wrote them down. Another shook his head, whispering, "God Almighty." Forensics swept the house. They bagged the towel, soaked in blood, the rug dragged awkwardly over stains, the bleach bottle under the sink. Every detail screamed of a rushed attempt to clean, to rewrite the truth, but nothing could erase what had happened. The gun was dusted, fingerprints lifted. The folder of medical documents was carefully sealed in evidence bags. Outside, the crowd grew thicker. News vans rolled in, antennas rising like insect legs, reporters speaking breathlessly into cameras. Breaking news out of Fairfield County. The sheriff's wife is dead, and the sheriff himself is in custody. By mid-morning, Harold was let out in handcuffs. The image would replay on screens across the nation. The once proud sheriff, head bowed, wrists shackled, his uniform shirt rumpled and stained. The crowd erupted in gasps. Some cursed him, spitting his name like venom. Others stood in stunned silence, tears in their eyes, unable to reconcile the man they admired with the reality before them. Detective Hughes watched it all unfold, her jaw tight. She knew this case would be unlike any other she'd handled. It wasn't just about piecing together evidence. It was about untangling a tragedy that reached into every corner of their community. And already, she could feel the storm brewing. This wasn't going to stay local. The moment the truth about Mrs. Whitmore's past became public, the case would explode into a national spectacle. Inside the station later that day, as Harold sat in an interrogation room staring at his reflection in the glass, the town was already dividing. Was he a cold-blooded murderer, or a man broken by betrayal? Was this about personal rage, or the crushing weight of small-town shame? Those questions didn't have answers yet. What the investigators knew for certain was simple. A woman was dead, a sheriff had pulled the trigger, and the story of Fairfield's perfect couple had been replaced with something far darker, something that would haunt the town for generations. And as Detective Hughes gathered the evidence, one thought pressed on her mind. If even the sheriff could be hiding a secret like this, what else might be buried behind the white picket fences of her quiet town? By the time the sun set on that first day, Fairfield County was no longer the quiet place it had been. News of the murder spread like wildfire, faster than deputies could answer phones or reporters could scribble in their notepads. Every diner, every gas station, every church fellowship hall buzzed with the same question. How could this happen? The sheriff, the man they trusted with their lives, was now accused of killing his own wife. That fact alone was enough to shake the community. But when the second truth broke, that the woman everyone knew as Mrs. Whitmore had been born male, the story ignited like gasoline. By nightfall, national news trucks crowded Main Street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Anchors in polished suits delivered live reports in front of the courthouse, their voices carrying across the country. In a shocking revelation, Sheriff Harold Whitmore's wife was not who she appeared to be. Records uncovered at the crime scene reveal she was transgender, a fact kept hidden from the public for more than 20 years. Tonight, the town is reeling. Inside homes, families sat glued to their televisions, forks paused over dinner plates. Some shook their heads in disbelief, muttering that it had to be a mistake. Others whispered that maybe they had suspected something all along. Her quiet nature, her modest clothing, her refusal to talk about her past. But few could comprehend the scale of the secret, or the violence it had unleashed. At the local church, Pastor Jameson called an emergency prayer meeting. Dozens gathered, their faces pale, hands folded tight. Some prayed for Harold, that God might forgive him. Others prayed for his wife, for her soul, for justice. But even in the pews, whispers rippled. Was it murder, or was it the breaking point of man deceived? On social media, the story exploded. Hashtags trended nationwide within hours. Hashtag sheriff scandal. Hashtag justice for her. Hashtag truth and betrayal. Twitter feeds divided into two camps. One side demanded accountability. He's a killer, plain and simple. No excuse. The other spun narratives of betrayal. Imagine being lied to for 20 years. Anyone would snap. The comments grew vicious. Strangers from across the country weighing in on a town most of them had never heard of before that day. Podcasters smelled blood in the water. Crime shows rushed out emergency episodes, dissecting every scrap of information they could gather. One host's voice echoed with disbelief. This isn't just a murder case. It's a mirror reflecting America's deepest prejudices and fears. In town, the divide was even sharper. At the diner, where Harold once drank his morning coffee, old men muttered that he was a victim of deception. Across the street at the hair salon, women cried openly, grieving for the woman they'd sat beside in church for years. Children whispered at school, repeating words they didn't fully understand, their teachers struggling to keep order. And then came the candlelight vigil. It began with a handful of friends and church members who wanted to honor her life. They gathered on the courthouse steps, holding candles that flickered against the dark sky. Within an hour, the crowd swelled, neighbors, activists, reporters, people from nearby towns. They laid flowers and photographs at the base of the courthouse, a makeshift memorial for a woman who had lived in silence, her truth buried until the night it cost her everything. One speaker, her voice trembling through the microphone, said she was more than a secret. She was a wife, a friend, a neighbor, and she deserved to live. The crowd murmured in agreement, candles held higher, the flame of solidarity burning brighter. But across town, at the VFW Hall, another meeting brewed. Men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Harold argued that he'd been pushed beyond reason, that betrayal of that scale was its own kind of crime. They spoke in low, angry voices, their words dripping with resentment toward the media, toward outsiders, toward anyone who dared call their sheriff a monster. Detective Carla Hughes watched all of this unfold with unease. She knew the investigation was only beginning, but already the town was splitting at its seams. The case wasn't just evidence and testimony anymore. It was a national conversation about truth, identity, betrayal, and violence. And every time she glanced at the growing pile of news clippings on her desk, she felt the weight of it pressing down harder. For the first time in living memory, Fairfield wasn't defined by its church bells or its sheriff's steady hand. It was defined by a tragedy that revealed more than a single man's crime. It revealed the fault lines running through the entire country. And as the vigil's candles burned low and the news vans rolled on into the night, one thing was certain. This case was no longer just Fairfield's story. It belonged to everyone now. The courthouse had never seen anything like it. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing every time a deputy pushed through the doors. Vans from national news stations clogged the street, cables snaking across the sidewalks like veins. Residents of Fairfield County, a place where gossip usually centered on Sunday sermons or high school football scores, now found themselves at the epicenter of a national firestorm. Inside, the air buzzed with tension as people filled the pew-like benches, waiting to witness the trial that would decide the fate of Sheriff Harold Whitmore. On the first day, Harold was led into the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit. His once proud posture collapsed into a slump. Shackles clinked at his ankles as the crowd gasped. This was the same man they'd seen in uniform, commanding and confident, the man who had carried the town on his shoulders. Now, stripped of his badge, he looked smaller, hollowed out. He didn't raise his eyes to the gallery. The prosecution wasted no time framing the story. Assistant District Attorney Carla Nguyen stood tall before the jury, her voice cutting through the silence. This is not just about betrayal. This is not about embarrassment. This is about murder, deliberate, calculated, and cold-blooded. She laid out the evidence piece by piece. The medical records found at the scene, the gun registered to Harold, the bleach stains on the floor, the neighbors who reported gunshots. The sheriff knew exactly what he was doing, and then he tried to clean it up. On the defense side, attorney Michael Trent countered with a different story. He painted Harold not as a murderer, but as a man pushed to the brink. For 20 years, ladies and gentlemen, this man lived a lie not of his own making. He was deceived by the one person he trusted most. And when the truth came out, he broke. He snapped, like any one of us might if we discovered our life was a house of cards. He leaned heavily on the words betrayal and shock, planting seeds of doubt about premeditation. The witnesses added flesh to the bones of the case. A neighbor testified about the shouting that night, her voice shaking as she recalled the sharp cracks of gunfire. A deputy described finding Harold slumped in the kitchen, his wife's body nearby. The medical examiner took the stand, outlining the wounds in clinical detail, close range, multiple shots, each one fatal. And then came the part that silenced the room, her medical history. The fact that she had been transgender, hidden from the town, hidden even from her husband, until the night it all unraveled. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, faces unreadable. The defense argued that this revelation was central to the case. It explained Harold's mental state, his panic, his rage. The prosecution, however, urged the jury not to be distracted. This isn't about who she was, A.D. Gwynn reminded them firmly. It's about what he did. And what he did was pull the trigger again and again until she was dead. The most chilling moment came when recordings of Harold's interrogation were played. His voice, hoarse and ragged, filled the courtroom. She lied to me. For 20 years, she lied. The words echoed like a confession. Heads turned toward him, but Harold kept staring at the table in front of him, as though if he didn't look up, the weight of the room might pass over him. The gallery was packed with familiar faces, neighbors, church members, former colleagues. Some cried quietly, clutching tissues. Others glared at Harold with undisguised anger. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs, "Justice for her" in bold black letters, while across the street another group waved placards reading he was deceived. Deputies had to stand between them, keeping the shouting matches from turning violent. For 2 weeks, the trial dragged on, every detail dissected. Forensic analysts described Harold's attempt to wipe the kitchen floor, proving consciousness of guilt. A ballistics expert confirmed the bullets matched his service revolver. The prosecution hammered the point. He didn't just snap. He had time to think, to stop, to choose another path, and he chose murder. The defense clung to the narrative of psychological break. They called an expert witness, a psychiatrist, who testified that Harold had suffered acute emotional trauma upon learning the truth about his wife. But under cross-examination, A.D. Gwynn pressed, "Doctor, trauma does not pull a trigger 3 times, does it?" The witness hesitated, and the jury leaned in. Closing arguments brought the courtroom to a boil. Nguyen's voice rose with conviction. He was the sheriff. He was supposed to uphold the law, not take it into his own hands. No matter what secrets came to light, no matter what shame he felt, nothing gave him the right to kill. Trent, in turn, pleaded with the jury to see Harold as human. A good man was deceived. He was humiliated in the most profound way. He acted out of fear, out of desperation. That is not first-degree murder. That is tragedy. The jury deliberated for 2 long days. The town held its breath, televisions tuned to every update, social media ablaze with speculation. Finally, the 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom, their faces solemn. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp filled the room. Harold closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging as though the words had knocked the last breath from him. In the gallery, some wept in relief, others in sorrow. The gavel struck. Life without parole. The sheriff who once embodied law and order was now condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars. Outside, reporters shouted into cameras, capturing the verdict that would define the case. The town of Fairfield, forever changed, struggled to reconcile its image of Harold Whitmore with a man now loaded into a prison van. His legacy was gone, his reputation shattered, and the woman who had lived quietly by his side for 20 years, her name, her story, was finally being spoken aloud, not as a secret, but as the victim she truly was. As the courthouse emptied, Detective Carla Hughes lingered on the steps, watching the candles flicker at the makeshift memorial across the street. She thought about the town, about the fault lines the case had revealed, about the cost of secrets buried too deep. And she knew that, no matter how many verdicts were read, some wounds would never heal. The trial ended, but the echoes of it lingered far beyond the courthouse walls. Fairfield County, once a postcard of small-town America, now carried a scar that would never fade. The sheriff was gone, locked away for life without parole, but the shadow of what he'd done still stretched across every porch, every church pew, every cracked sidewalk of Main Street. In the weeks after the verdict, the Whitmore home sat dark and empty. The once welcoming porch light was extinguished, the flower beds untended. People passed by quickly, unwilling to look too long at the house that had gone from symbol of stability to monument of betrayal. Children whispered ghost stories about it, daring each other to step on the front porch. For adults, though, the house wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by memories. The community itself was split. Some residents felt vindicated by the verdict, believing justice had been served. They lit candles at the memorial downtown, speaking her name softly, no longer treating her identity as shameful, but as part of the truth she'd carried too long in silence. She was our neighbor, one woman told a reporter, tears streaking her cheeks. That's all that matters. She deserved love. She deserved life. But others clung to bitterness. At coffee counters and barbershops, whispers still painted Harold as the victim of deception. He was a good man, one old-timer insisted. He kept this town safe. They pushed him too far. These conversations hardened the fault lines, creating rifts between neighbors who once waved easily across picket fences. The national media eventually packed up, their trucks rolling out to chase the next scandal, but the town was left to sift through the debris. For months, Fairfield became shorthand in op-eds and podcasts for everything America struggled with: prejudice, masculinity, the weight of secrets. Commentators debated endlessly. Was this story about murder, about gender, about pride, or about the dangers of silence? For Detective Carla Hughes, the case didn't end with the sentencing. She carried it home at night. The images of the crime scene burned into her mind. More than once, she drove past the memorial in the courthouse square, where flowers still appeared daily. The candles had melted down to wax puddles, but fresh notes and photos kept arriving. People wrote messages like, "We see you now," and "Truth should never cost a life." To Carla, those words mattered more than the verdict. They were small signs of a community learning to grieve, even if it didn't yet know how to heal. The Whitmore's extended families, both estranged and close, were shattered. Harold's relatives spoke little, humiliated by the fallen man they once bragged about at reunions. On the other side, her distant cousins, people who had lost contact when she built her life with Harold, came forward, shocked and heartbroken. They described her as kind, quiet, someone who had long feared rejection. All she wanted was peace, one cousin told a television crew. Instead, her life ended in violence. And now the whole world knows her story in the worst way possible. The legacy of the case stretched beyond Fairfield. Universities used it as a case study in criminal justice classes. LGBTQ+ advocates cited it in speeches, pointing to the dangers of secrecy forced by stigma. Some pastors used it as a warning against judgment, while others twisted it into sermons about sin and deception. The story, once confined to a single marriage, now belonged to everyone with an opinion, a headline, or a microphone. Yet for the people who actually knew them, It wasn't about debates or hashtags. It was about remembering the small things, the way she smiled politely at church suppers, the way Harold shook hands on the courthouse steps. The memory of their life together, once envied, now sat heavy like a stone no one could lift. Years later, people would still pause when passing the courthouse square. They'd glance at the bronze plaque installed near the steps, a memorial dedicated quietly, almost reluctantly, in memory of lives lost to violence and fear. May truth never again be silenced. The words didn't name her directly, but everyone in Fairfield knew who it was for. As for Harold, he disappeared into the prison system, another inmate serving life. Occasionally, letters arrived at the town clerk's office, scribbled apologies, ramblings about betrayal, regrets that rang hollow against the weight of what he'd done. Most went unanswered. Fairfield carried on, as towns do. The church bells still rang, kids still played baseball, Main Street still buzzed on Friday nights. But beneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding. Nothing here was as simple as it once seemed. The marriage no longer a fairy tale. Instead, they had become a cautionary story, a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most perfect lives, secrets can fester until they destroy everything. And so the town lived on, marked forever by the lesson that truth cannot be buried, not by fear, not by pride, not by love. Because in Fairfield, they learned too late that when secrets finally break free, they don't just ruin reputations. They take lives.